trapped with no escape. With COVID-19 forcing millions to stay at home, there's been a dramatic rise in domestic abuse. We ask why and what can be done to stop it during a pandemic. I'm Imran Garda, and today on the Newsmakers, we look at the coronavirus and domestic violence. Stay home, save lives, and protect the vulnerable. Since the start of this global pandemic, that's what we've been told. It's not safe to leave your homes. But what if it's not safe to be at home either? What if you're stuck with an abuser and have nowhere to go? That's the tragic reality for many right now. Of course, domestic violence isn't a new crisis, but it's one that's become worse during the coronavirus. According to the World Health Organization, cases of abuse have risen by as much as 60% in some countries. And the UN says if stay-at-home orders remain for much longer, more than 30 million people globally could face some form of domestic violence. So while public health measures are protecting us from the virus, who's protecting those at risk of abuse? We'll discuss that in a moment. But first, Haider Abbasi has this report.
Millions around the world are staying home to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But for many, that means facing another threat. Reports of domestic violence have surged since lockdowns were imposed.
Although data is scarce, member states are reporting up to a 60% increase in emergency calls by women subjected to violence by their intimate partners in April this year, compared to last.
Although difficult, victims were able to leave their abusers before the pandemic, either by finding shelter with family members or through charities. But the coronavirus has reduced those options, and for some, there's no escape. In South Africa, more than 120,000 cases of domestic abuse were reported after a lockdown was announced in March, double the usual amount.
Because we remember women are isolated, they're in captivity with their partners, and that makes it very difficult for them to seek help or access help. We know in South Africa that 3 women get killed every day. Those are our statistics on femicide, and that in itself makes us extremely concerned about issues of gender-based violence during the lockdown.
In some countries, people convicted of domestic violence have been released from prison early to restrict the spread of COVID-19. But this means their victims are again at risk. Women's groups fear the number of cases is much higher, as many survivors in abusive relationships are unable to alert the police. But why has it taken a pandemic to highlight violence against women? Critics say the problem should have received such attention before the outbreak. And what happens after the restrictions are lifted? Will the media still be interested in reporting on cases of domestic abuse? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to Johannesburg now, where I'm joined by Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. She's a United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UN Women. Evelyn Regner is in Brussels. She's the chair of the European Parliament's Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. And in London is Nicole Jacobs, who became the UK's first Domestic Abuse Commissioner last year. It's good to have you all on the programme. Thank you very much for joining us. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, let's begin with you. Has the data that has come through so far shocked you?
Well, not really. In every crisis, there tends to be a spike of violence against women. So we were anticipating this. But of course, everything happened so fast. The lockdown was not something that we foresaw, and that just compounded everything. The increase is on average is between 20 to 30%. In France, in South Africa, it's even higher. In Cyprus, in Australia, I mean, just across the world, that we're seeing the increase.
Evelyn Regner. Right. That's interesting, because I'm going to bring in Evelyn Regner. Do you make a distinction between different countries when you look at the numbers that have come through? And it has to be said, it was mentioned by Haider in his report as well, it's tough to actually have strong numbers, particularly when countries are dealing with coronavirus and under lockdown and so on. But is there a clear common thread amongst most nations when it comes to this issue, Evelyn?
I mean, this is clear. We can really say figures are going up. The helplines are running hot. So somehow this is something we can really say that's happening in France. It's happening in Italy, in Spain, dramatically going up. So we can say overall, women are really suffering under the situation of the lockdowns. We don't have all the figures yet because some countries are reporting more than others, but overall, we can really say this is an unprecedented crisis. And really, yes, women are suffering when they are alone at home with their partners, their family, whatever, all those getting nervous. And of course, there's also a link when the smaller and the tighter and the more narrow, the more nervous the society is becoming. So yes, we have a dramatic rise of the figures everywhere in European Union countries.
So Nicole Jacobs, a dramatic rise in the figures and less capability for recourse, less appetite even, perhaps, unfortunately, to do something about it. How do people who are in the midst of this actually find a way to get themselves out of it or get authorities to act, given the restrictions and given the context of the coronavirus crisis?
Yes. Well, for the last 8 weeks, I've hosted a call every Monday. In fact, I just came off my call for this week, and it's all of our national helplines in England and Wales, some of which are for male survivors, female survivors of abuse. Some helplines are for LGBT. So we have a range of helplines in England and Wales. And one of the things I can tell you is that since the very beginning of this crisis, we've seen a huge amount of increase in the helplines, but also more quieter ways of seeking help. So web chats, looking at web pages. We've been monitoring this weekend, week by week, and we can see, 2 and 3 and 4-fold increases in that kind of help seeking, where people are trying to figure out what information is out there, what they can do. We've had a national public awareness campaign called You Are Not Alone, which is really meant to get the word out to friends, family, neighbors, very importantly, employers. We have many people working from home. So there's a lot that can be done. And very importantly, here in England, England and Wales, it's been really important to make sure that people know that the police are expecting their call, that they are planning for this increase in domestic abuse, and that our national police leads for domestic abuse have really made sure that that's clear and that their response is available. So it's not just one thing we can do. It's just it's a whole host of things that we need to do throughout health settings, housing, police, and our services. Right. So there's a lot of work at hand.
Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, you're usually in the corridors of power in New York, but I'm assuming there's a lot of Zoom meetings and other type of meetings going on right now at the UN while you're in Joburg and others are elsewhere. Are countries, are nation states listening when we look at a global pandemic? Do they treat this as a priority when you present the numbers to them and say this is a serious issue, domestic abuse is rising?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I have to say that there are countries who have increased the resources, who have declared the services needed by women who are experiencing violence essential services. But we've also seen countries who have actually removed the resources that are devoted to fight gender-based violence away from women, who have closed the shelters that protect women in terms of violence and are using them for isolating people who are infected by coronavirus, which means they see corona as the bigger threat, and they see domestic violence as something that women must just go and cope with in some way or the other. So it's a mixed record. Any
particular countries you want to name?
France is one country that, for instance, we have seen that on the side of government, there's been a positive response. But just this afternoon, my staff in Vietnam was telling me that the shelters were closed and the resources that are meant to be going to women have been taken away. So, extreme reaction from both ends.
Right. Okay. And it's good that we get these examples because it helps us sort of crystallize this and make it more real, right? Because sometimes the data is just, it's just data, right? So when we look at specific countries, perhaps we can get a stronger idea of what's going on. I want to go back to Nicole here and talk about a kind of culture shift here, because your particular title, being the first domestic abuse commissioner, this is just something that's new, right? It was created last year, which in itself suggests that this wasn't a thing taken as seriously as it should have been taken for all these years up until now. Are you finding any resistance where people look at it with this perspective of, well, priorities, we first need to keep people alive and protect them from the virus? Yes, this is a problem, but it's a smaller problem.
Yeah, I was appointed in late September, and I'm independent of government, but I'm there to advise government, hold government to account. And the reason why, I think very importantly, as others have pointed out, is coming into this pandemic, we are not anywhere close to where we need to be, probably in any country, frankly, in terms of elevating this issue to the importance that it deserves, to acknowledge the widespread nature of domestic abuse and related issues. And certainly in England and Wales, we don't have robust funding for services or sustainable funding for services. So those have really shown during this COVID period. And I would say that government, on one hand, has reacted very responsibly in that they've fairly immediately set aside funding for services to sustain them through COVID. And in fact, this Thursday, our Prime Minister is hosting a summit on what is called unseen victims of the pandemic, of which domestic abuse is certainly one of them. So it's not so much about government not acknowledging, but I think just up until now, we haven't done the work that we needed to do. So therefore, we have cracks showing in our service systems and our focus during this time. And what I find day to day as the Domestic Abuse Commissioner is that government is listening, but we struggle to integrate into all of our areas of work, health, housing, all of social services, just the focus needed on this issue that it deserves. So part of my job is to do that, and certainly I can see the benefit in having a position like this that is independent of government but working really closely alongside.
Evelyn Regner, any place in the world right now that you can point to and say they're doing it right, they're reacting accordingly, they're punishing alleged abusers, and they're providing help to victims?
Well, I think many countries really try hard to give good examples. So I would like to give a couple of examples and start with our own house, with the European Parliament.
Sure.
100 women who are suffering under violence are living right now in the European Parliament. So in these times, there are many places, many offices that are not used. They are using those women, are living right now there. They are getting service and also using the canteen. And this should be a symbol and should be copied by many other countries as well. And therefore, I would like to point out Belgium, Germany, France, who was starting with that, opening hotels. Anyway, not having so many guests right now, or nobody. And we should use that. For women, it's important to know to act pragmatically, quickly, and not at all very bureaucratic. So really to help right now. And when women know there is a way, then they are also more courageous to raise their case and to say, okay, there is help. Spain is doing something really good. When you go to a pharmacy, one of those places you could also go during all the crisis and just say your code word, COVID mask 19. The pharmacists, the staff there knew, okay, I pressed the button and this is linked to the police. So what has been mentioned already, working closely together of the doctors, pharmacists with the police is something very important. And then there are some also good examples like Portugal, where there was a huge awareness campaign. The most important thing is, as already said, you are not alone. There are so many women in these circumstances, and many women are ashamed. They are not only afraid, they're also ashamed. And when you know there are so many of them and that there is help and it's really provided, it makes it already easier to say, okay, I use those tools that are existing. So it's a playing together of all this. We have to act quickly and in a non-bureaucratic way. So when you just have to fill in emails and whatever go long ways, then women give up.
Yeah, some brilliant examples there. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, I wonder, is there any mechanism, is there any possibility for someone watching this show, for example, who might be living in a country where they don't have these sorts of mechanisms that the likes of Switzerland might have, or other countries where you have code words in pharmacies, etc., where they can almost transcend the boundaries of their state and find a way to log their complaint online or elsewhere? I don't know. Is there something like that?
Well, there are international hotlines, but when a woman is experiencing violence, they need help at that time in their country. So there may be a difficulty to provide help for them in their own country in real time. But having said that, NGOs are the best allies for women who are experiencing violence. Women everywhere in the world, including those who are in countries that have limited services, civil society is one partner that we can rely on. They would move heaven and earth in order to make sure that they respond and they try to assist. And the media
Right.
is very important.
Right. But of course, there's the possibility of backlash, right? You get something out there and you're still stuck at home with your abuser, you might be in trouble.
Yeah. Well, that is the legitimate fear that women have sometimes.
Nicole, we're basing this conversation on, I guess, 3 months of data that has emerged, right? Different countries sounding the alarm, different organizations. And all of this is only really based on countries that are providing us data. Give us your gut take on this. What's your gut feel? Do you, in terms of what we don't know, in terms of the countries that are not giving us numbers, do you think it's probably far worse than we imagine?
Oh, yes.
I hate to say, but I absolutely do. I think that that any, as you described in your opening piece, the idea that within a lockdown, someone who is already subject to domestic abuse and is controlled, it's just logical that we know that the situation of the lockdown will make that far worse. It makes it much easier to control someone, much less able to for anyone to access support or advice. And so one of the things that we're planning for here in the UK is just the surge as our lockdown measures will start to alleviate over time. As we talk a lot about planning for the surge and people coming and finding help. So we can see in our helplines this call I mentioned every Monday, people looking for support and advice, and they will find a time when they feel it's appropriate or safe to act on that, and will absolutely be looking for more actively support and advice as described. We are anticipating a surge, and I think that is what we worry about, is just having the capacity within these NGOs to make sure that we can address that type of volume, because I do think inevitably that will be coming.
Evelyn, how much trauma and abuse is in the body of this iceberg under the surface? Is the data we're working with just the tip?
Quite huge. We just see that in a couple of countries. I'm talking about the European Union. You get more data and less data. We have this fantastic IGE, that's the European Institute for Gender Equality, that is really working on data, getting more and more. And what we are learning is that there is still missing a lot. Why? Many women are simply afraid to admit that they have and had been exposed to violence. So this is really a step-by-step progress. And globally, I'm sure it's even worse. We see huge differences in the European Union, and therefore I would like to put on the table this international dimension. There is one agreement that is very important, and this is named after the beautiful city of Istanbul, the Istanbul Convention, that is saying that violence against women should be condemned. This gives a strong sign to support women and to give a ban on all sort of violence against women. And it is so important that all countries really sign it, not only, but ratify it. And in these times, it is even more important. And if it's going on as slowly as it is, because we see there is a backlash in many countries, as Hungary, for example, that has to be said, that doesn't want to ratify. A strategy at the European Union's level to fight violence against women will be proposed by the Commission. That's what the responsible commissioner told me already. So this international ban and design globally is very important, so that it's not only the European Union or some places in the world.
Phumzile, when people look at the reaction to COVID-19 and the possible solutions, the debates everywhere about, how long the lockdown should continue for, when should economies open up and so on. It's happening where you are in South Africa, it's happening all over the world, right? People are very emotional about this. Now, when we look at it, a lot of people base it on things like looking at the curve, whether it's flattening, looking at the infection rates and so on. Is domestic violence, should it be rather a factor when countries consider when to open up? So, for example, the longer there's lockdown, the more squeezed people are financially. I mean, maybe an individual example, some guy loses his job, he's angry, he lashes out, he beats up his wife, abuses his kids, I don't know. But should this actually be a factor considered in deciding when to open up?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a straightforward answer to that. But what I want to say is that violence against women is a pandemic in its own right. It was there before COVID-19. It has increased during COVID-19. It will continue after COVID-19. We actually need a strategy that is fighting violence against women now during COVID, but it must be projected to go even beyond COVID-19. We must stay focused on it. We must flatten the curve for the virus, but we must also flatten the curve for gender-based violence. So we want people to be healthy, to stay alive. And to that extent, we recognize that there's a need for social distancing of some sort. In that, we must fight social distance without beating up women and continue with and demand from government to actually have targets that they want. They have targets about how much they want to flatten the curve for the virus. There must be targets also for women, and we must hold them accountable to a pace, intensity of the fight against gender violence.
Very strongly put. Nicole, once this is all over, what needs to change?
I think what you've just heard, this idea of a national strategy, international strategy, thinking of violence against women in those terms and what actions are needed, because we've learned a lot of lessons within COVID in terms of our service systems and what's not there and what could improve. And we need to make sure we maintain momentum for that kind of focus and that kind of change. Absolutely.
Evelyn Regner, your message to the people out there who need their voices heard and who feel that they're in a situation that they're finding it hard to get out of?
Strengthen women also in their financial independence, because the danger right now is children cooking, cleaning, teleworking, and the danger is that the 50s picture of women who stay at home is coming back, and then women are more exposed to their perpetrators. So to facilitate everything that strengthens financial independence.
Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, your message to our audience. You had a strong message for leaders and for governments in your last answer. As the final contribution to this program, your message for people who are watching this on their devices or on TV?
I just want women to know that they are not alone. It's important that to the extent that they can, they tell somebody what they are going through, because help can be on the way. And we're asking on the media not to switch off the light. Shine a light on this issue. Stay with it. It helps when you do that.
Well, it's been great to talk to all of you. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, Evelyn Regner and Nicole Jacobs. I thank you all for your time. And thank you very much for watching this episode of The Newsmakers. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.